Back when I was in college, the Student Campus Activity Council hired a famous ghost hunter to come speak at our school. I've always loved the paranormal, so I left my skeptical boyfriend behind in his dorm and hightailed it over to the auditorium. The ghost hunter was someone I'd never heard of, but he had an impressive background and seemed to have several things in the works at the time. This was in 2005. I think he actually might have a TV show now. He was a man of small stature, with a little white professor's beard and a receding hairline, but the way he spoke about the afterlife was fascinating. You could tell he truly believed what he claimed to see. Either that or he was a hell of a salesman. He had us hanging on every word. We watched some interesting video clips of his investigations. He had a nice collection of photos and scary stories to go with them. I remember one about a haunted doll that he said moved freely around the room of the person who had picked it up at a flea market, just not when anyone was around to witness it. Towards the end, he opened up the floor for questions. There were your typical dumbass college kid questions. Have you ever seen someone's head spin around like The Exorcist, stuff like that. And a few that were actually pretty interesting. I decided I wasn't going to let this opportunity to speak to someone so apparently revered in the field of the supernatural slip away, so I raised my hand. The ghost hunter spotted me, pointed, and smiled. "Yes, you the girl in the white shirt?" "Yeah, hi," I said, and I know I sounded nervous because I felt so dumb for sounding so nervous. I was just wondering, what's the scariest thing you can remember from your career as a ghost hunter? I was halfway back in the auditorium, quite a distance from the stage, but I saw his face fall. "I know I did." "Well," he said, forcing a tight little laugh. It was forced. I know it was. There are so many scary moments to recall. They tend to pop up quite often when you're in my line of work. This got a little chuckle from the audience. I suddenly felt pretty stupid for asking the question at all. He proceeded to tell some story about tracking a poltergeist in an abandoned elementary school and his flashlight failing. I remember, because it really wasn't very scary. At least it didn't seem that way for someone who hunts ghosts for a living. He moved on from the story and answered a few more questions. He didn't look my way again. When it was over and everyone started to leave, I decided not to get stuck in the crush of students leaving through the front door. Feeling somewhat dejected, like I had done something wrong, I slipped quietly out the theater exit and headed for my dorm. The ghost hunter was sitting outside on a bench near the bike racks, smoking a cigarette. I ducked my head and tried to get by without him noticing. "Hey kid," he took another drag and crushed the cigarette out on the cement bench beside him. "Listen, I'm sorry." I remember blurting, feeling like such a stupid little girl. "I know my question was dumb. I wasn't trying to make fun of you or anything." He shook his head. He brushed the ashes off the bench. He patted the space beside him, inviting me to sit. I hesitated. This could definitely be a case of stranger danger, just like they taught in the Intro to University classes. Then sat down, keeping a healthy distance between us. He was old, I was young, I could probably outrun the guy. Or who knows, maybe I was just as stupid as I felt. "I didn't tell the truth," the ghost hunter said. His face looked much older close up, the wrinkles deeper. The confident salesman aura had faded from him, leaving behind a man in his 60s who had clearly seen a lot of things. That story I told, it wasn't the scariest moment of my career. "I know," I remember saying. He nodded as though he had known I knew. "This is the scariest moment of my career," he said, and this is what he told me. It was the 1970s. I was a much younger man. I hadn't reached success in the paranormal industry quite yet, and was left to pick up the scraps that the pros didn't want. Usually they were schizophrenics, whose broken minds tricked them into believing there were phantoms after them, or children playing pranks on gullible and concerned members of the neighborhood. If anything, it was a simple cleansing of the home with sage, and off I went. When I first got the call, I was ecstatic. What the client was describing appeared to be a full-blown demonic haunting, complete with physical manifestations, possession, and multiple witnesses. It was the break I was searching for. It was the break I needed. The only detail that truly worried me was that their teenage son, the person they claimed to be suffering from possession, had become violent with members of his family. Up until recently, he'd only acted out of character moody. However, a week prior, he had tried to rape his older female cousin. She was shaken, but mostly unharmed. The family sent her to live elsewhere until it could all be figured out. Therefore, when I headed out to their home, I made sure to arrive fully prepared. I brought holy water, crucifixes, sage, and, just for good measure, a small loaded handgun. I knew it wouldn't come to that, but something about the mother's frantic tone over the phone told me it was just a good idea. I wish I could say the visit itself was exciting. Unfortunately, from the moment I pulled into the driveway of the beautiful remodeled Victorian, all activity seemed to stop. That is, if it was ever there to begin with. I spent 2 weeks investigating the home. I used equipment considered very technologically advanced for the era. I studied energy waves. I interviewed the son whose family claimed to be possessed, when in fact he just seemed to be depressed, perhaps psychologically disturbed. I recommended a therapist, a renowned child psychologist who was famous for his work with violent young men. On my last day in the house, they took him into the city for treatment. His parents returned shortly before midnight, retiring warily to their bedroom, leaving me alone in the kitchen to go over my findings. There was nothing to be said, and I knew it. Everything they described could be written off to the hysterics of a family who couldn't admit their son was in desperate need of medical attention. Everything, that is, except for the drains in the floor. Upon touring the home, I was impressed with how up-to-date it had been brought. It was clearly from the early 1900s and kept in immaculate condition. The woodwork and character of the house was carefully preserved as it was given necessary updates like modern plumbing and electricity. The basement was the only area that seemed stuck in time. The walls were a clammy stone that was prone to gathering moisture, leaving it unfit to store anything vulnerable to spiders or mold. The family had left it empty for this reason, and while it certainly felt very spooky to spend any amount of time in the windowless room with the single hanging light and its vast cement floors, I never recorded anything of note in this area. However, there was one thing I couldn't understand. Given the approximate time the home had been built and its presence in a residential neighborhood, there was simply no accounting for the 4 large slotted drains set in the cold concrete floor. As I sat alone in the kitchen, poring over my meager findings, trying to find meaning in all these words, I heard something. It was only a little sound at first, and so I ignored it. But then it came again, louder this time. There was a steep spiral staircase that led to the second floor, winding up from the corner of the small kitchen, and it was where the noise seemed to be coming from. Assuming it was simply one of the homeowners restless after dropping their son off in an institution, I glanced up. It was coming down the stairs. I can't say walking because that wasn't the case. It was just, floating isn't even the right word, just coming down the stairs straight at me. It had no eyes, it had no face, and yet somehow I knew it was looking at me, right at me, into the very depths of my soul. Then it spoke. I'm not sure how it spoke. I don't think I actually heard anything, so perhaps it used some sort of telepathy? Either way, I can recall the words to this very day. You know what he did to us. I didn't think. I couldn't. I just ran. I upended my chair when I fled, scattering papers across the kitchen that claimed this house wasn't really haunted. It was all the hallucinations of a very sick boy. I left them there. Do you know how awful that is? I left those people in that house with that thing. I didn't stop driving for 30 miles, for God's sake. When I realized how far I'd gone, I finally pulled over and called the family from a payphone. They were the furthest thing from my mind when I saw it. All I could do was respond to the deep animal instinct to escape, to run out of that supposedly safe house with my tail between my legs. They moved, I think. I was unable to continue my investigation. In writing, I cited insufficient evidence, but I knew it was cowardice. I believe the house was leveled a few years later. I ended up doing my own research. Curiosity ate away at me with vicious little rat teeth as time went by, the accusation still ringing fresh in my ears. You know what he did to us. And eventually, yes, I did. Old newspaper clippings didn't tie the stories together. Not necessarily, but I was able to piece some meaning out of the yellowed excerpts. At some point around the turn of the century, the house had been residence to a well-respected mortician. Unable to find a building in town to suit his needs, he said he built his own home/office space. It was a grand feat of architecture and a shining example of a true entrepreneur, a man pursuing the American dream of running his own business. Upstairs, the bedroom. Mid-level, the funeral home. In the basement, a mortuary. I knew what the drains were for. Separately, decades later, another well-respected member of the local community was arrested under the suspicion of abuse of his professional position with moral cause. The newspaper didn't elaborate, probably due to the sensitive nature of the crimes, but his punishment was minor. After a brief stay in the local jail, the perpetrator stripped his home of all its value and left town before trial, never to be seen again. It didn't take much to guess the connection. I suppose I don't know for sure, but the words of that thing still echo through my head to this day. You know what he did to us. There was a reason that mortician felt such a strong desire to build a house that contained his business to suit his needs. The things that were done to those bodies in the basement were unspeakable. But yes, I know. I know what he did to them. And it's because of this coming face to face with the true nature of man in its darkest places that the encounter with that faceless thing is the scariest moment of my career. 'Cause now I know. I still remember his expression, the way all the color dropped out of him as he went on the white hair of his beard, barely distinguishable from his pale skin. The slump of his shoulders, the way his voice shook. I apologized. He waved me off. He left. I felt terrible. I still feel terrible for making him relive that moment. But as I grew up, as campus activities were replaced with bills, and my own career, the ghost hunter fell from the forefront of my mind little by little. Until last week when I moved in with my fiancé, when I took the boxes into the basement despite his warnings of spiders and mold, because there's a large slotted drain in the center of the room, and I'm so worried, so scared about what I might know. When I was young, about 6 or 7, I always had a hard time sleeping. I would lie in bed for hours staring at the wall, the ceiling, the back of my eyelids. Sometimes I would get up and sneak outside, opening and closing the back door at a snail's pace to avoid any creaking, afraid my parents might rip me a new one for daring to go out in the dark by myself at night. Our house rested at the top of a hill, and the backyard sloped downwards, elegantly decorated with soft grass and beautiful flowers. In the daytime, it was gorgeous, but at night, it was incredibly dark and quiet. Most children would have been terrified walking out there at night, but I found a way to make it peaceful. I would walk down the hill and climb the tree at the bottom, just to stare at the lights across the neighborhood. The dark couldn't engulf me up there. I was safe as long as I could keep my little hands and feet in the right places. Some nights, my parents and older sisters would be up late, and they would let me watch TV with them. My mother and sisters were particularly fond of ghost hunting shows. We'd all sit together, holding one another, terrified, as we watched people exploring old or abandoned locations, listening to ghosts, speaking to them through their little devices. We all bonded over our shared interest in the paranormal. I'd never once considered that our interest in the paranormal would lead to this. The weekend had finally come, and while I was excited to have 2 days off of school, my mom and dad were excited for their weekly night out. Every Saturday, my parents would get themselves a hotel room and have a night out in the city together. My 2 oldest sisters, Tyra and Felicity, were always left in charge of us younger kids. When night would come and our parents would leave, Tyra and Felicity would put the rest of us to bed so they could watch TV. The same was true for this weekend. I, however, found myself struck by insomnia once again. I tossed and turned in bed, trying my best not to wake my little brother up with my constant movement. He snored in his bed beside me, and I stared at him in jealousy. He could somehow fall asleep in just minutes, a superpower I envied. I slowly descended down the stairs, praying my sisters wouldn't be upset with me for being awake. Luckily, they both smiled at me as I reached the bottom. I smiled back at them as I stared into the living room. "Hey, bud, what are you doing awake?" Tyra asked from the couch, her voice soft and gentle. My parents were never as kind to me as my older sisters were. They were both teenagers, but much sweeter and more understanding than my parents. They weren't very responsible, though. "I can't sleep. What are you guys watching?" I asked, approaching Felicity, who was sitting on the floor eating from a large bowl of chips. I sat beside her and looked at the TV. Commercials were playing. Something for adults. You can be in here when it comes back on. But don't be mad at me if I cover your eyes when bad stuff happens. Felicity told me, holding the bowl of chips out in my direction. I grabbed a handful and sighed. "Okay, but that's just kind of boring," I complained, shoving a couple chips in my mouth. "Actually, I agree, I'm bored of this already. We've been watching for an hour and nothing good is happening. Can we watch something else?" Tyra asked, earning a groan from Felicity. I listened to the two of them argue for a couple minutes while I slowly finished the bowl of chips. When Felicity realized what I'd done, she rolled her eyes and grabbed the bowl from me. "Come on, these chips are expensive." She stood up and began walking to the kitchen, presumably to refill the bowl or put it in the sink. Tyra followed her, an empty glass in hand. I followed as well, not wanting to be alone in the living room. While my sisters gathered more snacks and drinks, I stared out the window, and the endless abyss of the backyard stared back at me. It was especially dark that night, and it left me more scared than usual. My thoughts ran wild as to what could be hiding in the darkness just down the hill. I stared for what felt like 10 minutes, almost as if I were protecting my older sisters by keeping watch. When I saw what I thought was movement through the shadows just at the edge of the hill, I felt chills go down my spine. I tried my best to remind myself of the wildlife we'd constantly witnessed trotting around out there. It could have been a rabbit, a bird, maybe even a deer. Cutting through my thoughts, I heard my name and someone saying something about ghost hunting. "What?" I asked, turning to face my sisters. "I asked if you want to go ghost hunting with us." We decided not to watch anything anymore. Tyra told me, an odd look on her face. The way she looked at me kept me afraid. She looked excited, but in a way that I can only describe as disturbed. I'd never seen her look like that. "Ghost hunting where?" I asked quietly, already terrified by the idea. "Just in the backyard. Maybe it could be fun. You never know what we might find out there." Felicity responded, eating a couple chips while she held up a flashlight as if to reassure me we'd be safe in the light. She had the same odd look on her face, like she knew something I didn't. I didn't question their sudden change of plans, though I did wonder why they'd prepared drinks and snacks, only to suddenly want to go outside for who knows how long. It was then that the light bulb went off in my head, and I had the genius idea to stay inside and watch them from the window whilst eating their snacks. I'd be safe, and my belly would be full. My little brain thanked itself for the wonderful plan. "I'm kind of scared. Maybe I could just watch you guys? I could be the lookout by the window." I suggested. They both nonchalantly shrugged and began putting their shoes on, which surprised me, as my siblings tended to be far more stubborn than that. They didn't seem to care that I didn't want to come with them, though. Felicity simply handed me a flashlight of my own. "You can use this to watch us," she told me. I was both terrified and excited by what they were doing. I'd never considered our backyard could have ghosts. I kept imagining some transparent person attacking them or hearing a disembodied voice. As they walked out the back door, I grabbed the bowl of chips and placed it on my lap while I sat by the back window. I watched them slowly stepping into the grass, their flashlights on, whispering to one another. I turned mine on and pointed it out the window, which they noticed as they turned back and waved at me. I ate a handful of chips as I watched. "Oh, Ghosty, where are you?" Tyra sang out slowly, stepping further into the grass. The darkness began to swallow the two of them, their silhouettes becoming less visible, but their flashlights shining at the trees in the distance. I immediately became afraid. I didn't want to lose sight of them. "Guys, don't go down the hill. I can't see you then," I called out, scared out of my mind. They didn't respond, they just kept walking. They should have been able to hear me. Why were they ignoring me? As I sat there worrying, my flashlight suddenly turned off and my stomach dropped. I could barely see their silhouettes anymore. I began to panic a bit, slapping the flashlight, banging it against the windowsill, calling out for my sisters to wait. I watched them slowly descend down the hill, almost as if they were in a trance. "Guys, stop. My flashlight is off. I can barely see you. Stop." They kept walking, their silhouettes completely disappearing, now covered by the top of the hill. Even their flashlights weren't visible anymore. I sat there panting, sweating, completely terrified. This wasn't fun at all. I was just worried. My young mind couldn't understand that there was a chance they might have just been messing around with me. I heard Felicity's voice call out in the distance, saying something to the ghosts. I watched, hoping they would come back up the hill any second. Then something changed. The air suddenly felt heavy. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew something was wrong. Terribly wrong. I felt goosebumps all over my skin. My sisters' voices just barely audible as they giggled about something. It was then that I saw it, whatever it was, stepping into view from the side of our house. My blood ran cold and I began to sweat bullets. I was frozen. Was this some kind of ghost? My mind couldn't comprehend what I was looking at. It floated shakily through the grass towards the hill where my sisters had gone. It had a form that resembled a human, but it looked like a floating mass of something black, transparent, and gelatinous. The way it moved was like each segment of its limbs were grabbing the air and pulling itself along. It moved in complete silence until it disappeared into the darkness, most likely descending down the hill towards my sisters. I couldn't understand it. I just stared in horror. "Guys!" I just barely shouted out. I felt sick. There was nothing but silence for at least a minute straight, until I heard the worst sound I'll ever remember in my life, cutting through the darkness. Two loud, eardrum-shattering, guttural screams came from down the hill. I immediately recognized the screams to belong to my sisters. I began to shake violently, tears running down my face as I covered my mouth in horror. I prayed that this was nothing but a sick joke, but they wouldn't stop screaming. They screamed and screamed, both of them howling like tortured animals. Their screams bent and twisted into pained cries, their voices breaking and becoming raspy, and I just sat there, my stomach hurting, completely frozen, listening to every second of what sounded like hellish agony. I began to throw up when one of them yelled out for our mother. The screams finally faded away, just as suddenly as they'd started. The air felt as if it had changed again, as if it had become less heavy. It even looked a bit lighter outside, even though it was midnight. The stars were more visible. I just stared into the backyard, my head pounding and aching, as I begged the universe to bring my sisters up that hill, for them to walk up and tell me it was just some kind of messed up prank. But they never did. I called the police, trying to tell the woman on the phone what had happened, through my sobbing. It took no time for the cops and my parents to show up. The rest is hard to remember. All I could think about was their screams. When the police found nothing, and my neighbors all claimed they hadn't heard any screaming, I fell into years of dissociation and depression. My parents never believed my story, at least not the part about the mysterious creature and the screaming. They seemed convinced my sisters had run away. They seemed convinced that for some odd reason I had lied for my sisters. No bodies, no evidence, nothing left behind. Just an unbelievable story from a little boy. My relationship with my family was tainted from then on. As I grew older, throughout every family event, holiday, vacation, graduation, there was always a tense energy. Nobody ever looked at me the same. A couple times throughout the years, my parents would pull me aside to interrogate me, try to get me to tell them the truth. I never could. The image of their disappointed faces will be burnt into my mind forever, just like the image of that thing. The thing that took my sisters, did whatever it did to them to earn screams like that. Sometimes I would hope to see that creature again. I would pray that it would take me away, bring me to my sisters, or at least do to me what it did to them. I couldn't help but feel like I deserved it somehow. It wasn't until I was 20 in college that I saw it again. Now I'm even more terrified. I have even more questions. I was lying in bed unable to sleep. For some reason, my insomnia had come back just to torture me again. My roommate Paul was out somewhere, most likely at a party. I had gotten used to him arriving at our dorm in the latest hours of the night, usually drunk or high. While deep in thought, trying to fall asleep, I felt the air become heavy. The backs of my eyelids had become darker. I immediately felt sick, and I sat up quickly, facing the wall. The air had felt just like it did that night years ago. All of the hair on my body shifted, stood up as chills went down my spine once more. It can't be, I thought. Why now? The door to my dorm suddenly swung open, causing me to jump. The light poured in, illuminating the wall in front of me. I let out a sigh of relief. It had to be my roommate. I was just being paranoid. I turned to face the door, expecting to see him there. Instead, there was nobody. "Hello, Paul?" I called out, my mind racing. I kept telling myself I was being dramatic, letting my mind wander to a terrible conclusion before a realistic one. It had to be Paul messing with me, right? The sound of something wet, something shifting, interrupted my thoughts. I watched in terror as that creature, pulled itself through the air, floating into the room. I stared frozen, like I had become a child again. Something was different about it. I could see through its head, something floating within the gelatinous substance. It was then that I realized the creature wasn't facing me. What I was seeing through its head was a pair of eyes. As if it could sense my curiosity, it began to turn, slowly towards me. I watched as each of its body parts turned and shifted through the air, independent of one another. I didn't know what to do. It was almost as if I had just accepted my death, that I was going to let this thing do to me what it did to my sisters. As it faced me, my stomach began to churn. No, I mumbled, my entire body shaking violently. I couldn't move. The being just stared at me, taunting me with its new eyes. I understood immediately why I hadn't seen the creature with eyes before, but the answer only brought me more questions. I recognized those eyes. I recognized them, but I didn't want to believe it. The left eye belonged to Tyra. The right eye belonged to Felicity. I lurched forward uncontrollably as I spilled the contents of my stomach onto the carpet. All I could hear was the wet shifting of the creature's body parts and ringing in my ears. I closed my eyes. I didn't want to look anymore. I couldn't, not when Tyra and Felicity's eyes were looking back at me. After what felt like an eternity of panting and sobbing, I finally gained the courage to do something, or at least say something. What did you do to them?" I asked, my voice raspy and hoarse. I kept my eyes closed and waited for some kind of answer, if the damn thing could even speak. "Oh, Ghosty, where are you?" I heard Tyra's voice singing out from the direction of the creature. I only cried harder. Not only did the being steal their eyes, but their voices too. How? Thousands of ideas circled through my mind. What else did that thing take from my sisters? The air suddenly became thinner and my eyes snapped open. I could hear the voices of other students approaching down the hallway. I looked toward the creature just as it floated away faster than I had ever seen it move. Just like that, the doorway was empty and I didn't feel sick anymore. The voices of other students came closer. I could hear my roommate saying goodbye to whoever he'd been walking with. Paul stepped into view, the smile on his face dropping once he saw me. I could tell he was drunk. "Dude, what the fuck is going on? Why'd you puke all over the carpet?" he asked. I didn't respond. Instead, I stood up and walked into the bathroom. I didn't know what to say, how to explain to anyone what had just happened. It's been months since then. My life has completely fallen apart. All I ever do is try to find evidence as to what the being could have been and how I could find it again. I don't understand why it didn't do to me what it did to my sisters. It felt as if that thing showed up just to taunt me, to make fun of me, to tell me that I would never find the real answers. That is why I've come here to tell my story. To seek help, extra opinions without judgment, without being told that I'm making it all up. I will not stop searching until I find that creature again. Until I finally get some answers as to what happened. Maybe then I'll finally stop hearing Tyra and Felicity's screams in the back of my mind.